Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Rebecca Burgess, and I'm the founder of Fibershed. And I'm here today as part of our 7th annual Fine Fiber and Wool Symposium. And this year, I want to start by thanking those who helped keep me warm this morning. And we're in this smoke-filled haze that's keeping the energy of the sun from heating up our surroundings, and it's a little cooler than I'm used to. And I wanted to thank, my sweater is from Sally Fox's farm, and she's over there. And this is the color of her sheep that I'm wearing. I want to thank Lonnie Estelle, who's next to Sally, over there, for the wool in this coat that's mixed with Robin Lyne's wool, who's right there. And their wool was woven together by Ryan and Kat Houston, who are not here, but the Houston Textile Mill wove this fabric. And then I want to thank Daniel DeSanto for sewing this fabric, and I want to thank the perennial species Rubia tinctoria madder root for dyeing this color. So in gratitude for warmth, and thank you, everyone. So today we're going to continue our annual conversation. Really, these are conversations that are a continuum. If you've been coming every year, we keep evolving this idea and philosophy of what is this thing called a fiber shed? And really, it's underpinned by these ecosystem processes that are defining the function of our regional fiber, dye, and food shed. AKA ecological processes underpin our existence. And so every year we explore more about our bioregion, the processes occurring within our bioregion. And today you will hear from people who have an 11,000 year plus generational continuum with the land that we now know as North Central California. This arc of time has provided hundreds of human generations the ability to observe natural cycles. And through those observations, these individuals were able to derive practices of engagement that, I just want to quote one individual who's not here today. I'll get to her in a moment. But this idea of the land we call North Central California, it was written about in 1868 by, of course, a European whose language we could translate. That this land, there was no country in the world as well supplied by nature. This was written in 1868. The hills, the valleys, the plains are filled with elk, deer, hare, rabbit, quail, and other animals fit for food. Its rivers and lakes are swarming with salmon, trout, and other fish. Their beds and banks are covered with mussels and clams and other edible mollusca. The rocks and its seashores are crowded with seals and otters, and its forests are full of trees and plants bearing acorn, nuts, seeds, and berries. That was from Titus Fay, who wrote In the Natural Wealth of California. An extension of this idea of North Central California as an abundant land, not unlike that of an isolated island. The plants, animals, landscapes that native people of California have a distinctness and unusual diversity that casts them apart from the rest of the mainland of North America, that is. This is apparent to every European visitor or colonizer during the period of early exploration. 1/3 of what we know to be California as a state, 6,300 native plant species are endemic, meaning they only show up here. And they grow nowhere else on this planet. We have 19 of the 90 oak species that grow in the United States, and this land contains nearly all of the world's approximately 60 species of manzanita, and 43 of the 45 species of California lilacs. In 1542, 100 languages resonated across California's myriad landscapes, 1/4 of all the languages that existed. And this all comes from tending the wild. Thank you, Kat Anderson, who is not going to be here with us today due to a family emergency, but I wanted to weave her into my presentation and introduction this morning. So as you hear from this generational continuum, this land was highly populated, and that abundance that I describe is coexisted with populations of native California communities. You will also hear today from people who live on this land today who maybe don't have the longest ancestral ties back 11,000 plus years, but are using some of the same anthropogenic tools to manage their food and fiber shed, those that are using prescriptive fire to manage their landscape. You will also hear from a group of young agrarians today. And these are young people who are defining a new sense of livelihood on this land. And they're doing so while creating integrated agricultural systems that are building soil carbon, that are reducing and eliminating the use for synthetic compounds. And these projects that you'll see and hear about more today are examples of where we are reweaving perennial agriculture and animals back into what are considered fairly monocultured systems. So we're diversifying. And how are we doing that while producing these livelihoods for young agrarians? So you'll hear from those people directly today. You'll also hear from people who understand how sensitive the ecology is, where we derive our fiber, dye, and food from, and how these individuals are working with these precious materials to keep these materials in play in our fiber shed. What are the strategies that we can deploy to create beauty that extends far beyond the typical cycles of fast fashion? So you'll hear from those individuals as well who don't produce these materials but are on the design side, who design with these materials and work on the recycling and mending culture. But the whole of our conversation today is contextualized by the recent presence and impact of catastrophic fire. A fire whose increased intensity has and is a product of our management and our choice to operate and power our economy with fossilized carbon, whose transformation into heat-trapping gases has and continues to heat our planet. This new intensity of fire has raised the question for all of us: how do we create local food, fiber, and dye sheds in the face of a rapidly transitioning ecosystem? How do you localize the economy when the ground under your feet is shifting quite rapidly? So that's the question we will explore today. One of the ways our community of people has responded, pretty much everyone in this marketplace today, and by the way, if you purchase from any of the farmers and artisans today, 10% of what you purchase will go to fire recovery in Butte County, which is where the latest campfire is only at 5% containment. So what are we doing in our community of farms and ranches to respond to the legacy load of CO2 in the atmosphere and the heat-trapping gases that we have pumped into that atmosphere that is creating the instability? We are, right now, and thanks to Sally Fox actually, we have mapped all of the carbon baseline samples that we've taken in our community. So we have now 44 farms and ranches that are mapping the amount of soil organic carbon in their soil, and they've committed to increasing soil organic carbon content. And we've roadmapped that if on these farms and ranches, if 1% of the land mapped here, if 1% of that land were to increase its soil organic carbon content by 1%, so 1% of the land managed, increasing soil organic carbon by 1%, we could remove 333 million pounds of carbon from our atmosphere, and we could offset 118,000 vehicles driven for 1 year. 1% of the land, 1% increase, just from those red dots. So there's a lot we can do. So that's the hope, right? And why do we need to consider in all of this land management? These bar graphs here, the orange bar graphs, are the CO2 emissions in millions of metric tons for fire that has gone catastrophic on federal lands in California. The blue bar graph shows how much of weighted emissions we've created through our cap and trade system in California. Basically, the blue shows you how much carbon our economy has been able to offset. So these are the management of smokestacks and tailpipes, bike lanes, energy efficiency, that's the blue. But one catastrophic fire can throw all of that out of whack. And we are currently not measuring the emissions from catastrophic fire in our scorecard for emissions in California. So when we say we've met our emissions goals 4 years early, we're not including the emissions of fire. So there's far more emissions going into our atmosphere than we're accounting for, and so this is why we're tackling fire today. It's not only that it's devastating and catastrophic because of our mismanagement, it's also because it plays a hefty role in the climate conversation. So, before I complete this, I just wanted to say that there is another narrative that you'll hear about today, and this is in honor of Kat Anderson, who taught me about the beneficial disturbance. It was about how human populations observed tides, wind, fire, gophers, all of these processes that were occurring before at bears, observing animal and elemental impact, and then taking the study of elemental impact and embodying that into a practice regime that we would call a beneficial disturbance. How do you use fire to benefit the geophyte population or the perennial seedgrass population, which are the food sources? Approximately 80% of the food was actually seed and geophyte bulbs, seaweeds and greens in this community. And so you could use fire to manage for benefit. You could use digging to manage for benefit. You could use coppicing to manage for benefit. Kat's the one who brought this understanding to me that the native California communities believed in regeneration. They saw it, they understood it, and they knew how to enhance regeneration. And this was the piece that's just overwhelmed me 20 years ago when I saw this, that she shared with me, that's in her book, was these regeneration cycles that the basket weavers were part of. So you'll hear from basket weavers today how they manage systems to enhance the regeneration cycle of the hazel, of the redbud, of the deer grass, the bear grass, all these materials, the sedges. They were able to tighten the regenerative cycle of these plants and collaborate with these plant species to create their material culture. This graph is what set in motion Fibershed to me. It is the highest form of ecological balance that I could have ever imagined, where you are actually not necessarily throwing out a monoculture, but you are throwing out your little disturbances to a polyculture and enhancing cycles. And she told me about these mosaic patchworks of the landscape and how these plants existed. 1 minute, okay. So I got really excited about native California landscapes. And then I realized that even my own ancestry, even though I'm not of Native American descent, when I went to the North Atlantic in May of this last year, I went to an area called the Heathlands, which go from northern Portugal into the fjordal lands of Norway. And what I observed was that in the Heathlands, they too are closing the loops from the Neolithic era 5,000 years ago to present day. My ancestors were also using fire as a beneficial disturbance to manage Neolithic farmed sites. They were also using the bilsow sheep to graze. So between fire and grazing, my ancestors were developing sites that were completely self-sustaining in the fjords and all the way down, like I said, to Portugal. So this cycle, this is a Neolithic farm site that's been farmed for 5,000 years in Western Norway. It's on the Isle of Lygra. This is the management. That's a picture of the bilsow sheep on the right, and that's the community coppicing the heather. So the heather, the heathlands. They also use burning. And this is the diversity and the biology that they see as a succession of their, or a response to their beneficial disturbances in Lygra. And so Kat also introduced me to this book by Wendell Berry, Unsettling of America, written the year I was born. And I felt like I wanted to end, this particular introduction with an idea of what culture could be, which is honoring these continuums and that we have so much to learn from the speakers today because they're part of a much longer continuum on this landscape than many of us, and we have so much to learn from that continuum. And I would like to thank you all for listening to all that. And